My parents promised to pay for college, then blew my tuition on a vacation home. I cut ties for 10 years. Until my dad called with shocking news. So, I'm a 28-year-old guy now, but this all started when I was 18 and ended up running away from home. The reason? My parents let me down big time. They'd always said they'd help pay for my college, made it sound like a sure thing, and I trusted them. But when the time actually came, they backed out at the last possible second. Told me they just couldn't afford it, and I was left scrambling, with no choice but to try and find someone else to help cover the costs. Now, don't get me wrong, I wasn't some entitled kid who thought they owed me everything. That's not what this is. But the thing is, they'd flat out promised. No maybe or we'll see. They were clear from the beginning, when the time came, college would be taken care of. That was the deal. My folks weren't struggling or anything either. My dad owned a business that was doing pretty well, and my mom had a decent career as a real estate agent. We lived a comfortable life. I never really had to worry about money growing up, and I'm grateful for that, I truly am. I went to private schools my whole life, never had to get a job, never needed to stress about bills or expenses. Everything was handled, and they always made sure I had what I needed. And honestly, the reason I never got a job or tried to save for college myself was because they kept assuring me they had it covered. It wasn't like I was lazy, I just didn't think I needed to worry about it. They made it sound like they had a plan, and I believed them. Why wouldn't I? Up until then, they'd never given me a reason to doubt them. They were always there for me, and we had a good relationship. I wouldn't say I was spoiled, but I was definitely looked after, no question. I also wasn't one of those kids who asked for extravagant things, I was pretty low maintenance. But right around my 18th birthday, I started noticing a shift, especially with my dad. He seemed tense, buried in his work more than usual, and spending long hours holed up in his office. That just wasn't like him. He looked constantly stressed out, and I couldn't figure out why. I remember asking my mom a few times if he was okay, but she'd always brush it off and tell me he was fine even when it was obvious something was bothering him. That tension lasted for a few months, and I figured it must have been work-related. I didn't press too hard though, because I was knee-deep in finals and had a lot on my plate myself. I just focused on studying and tried not to get too distracted. Once finals were out of the way, I was ready to celebrate turning 18. I figured I'd get to relax a bit and enjoy my birthday. Things were going okay, until that morning. On my birthday, my parents came into my room to wish me a happy birthday. But instead of just saying their piece and heading out, they told me to get dressed and come downstairs for a family meeting. That alone set off a little alarm in my head. They looked really serious, like something heavy was coming. I didn't know what, but I knew it wasn't good. I got ready and headed downstairs. We all sat in the living room, and my dad started talking. He said he had something he needed to get off his chest, something he'd been keeping from me for a while. My mom barely made eye contact, and my dad looked nervous, which only made me more anxious. He went on to explain that his business had been going through a rough patch the last few months. That's why he'd been working overtime and acting stressed all the time. He'd been doing everything he could to keep the business afloat and make sure his employees still got paid. Apparently, he'd even taken pay cuts himself just to cover their wages. Meanwhile, my mom had been managing all the household expenses on her own, which wasn't easy considering our lifestyle and the fact that she didn't make nearly as much as my dad. But, he said, things were finally starting to turn around. The business was stabilizing, and they were on track to recover the money they'd lost. At first, I thought that was the whole reason for the meeting. They just wanted to loop me in, maybe get a little support or understanding. But nope, there was more. A lot more. Then came the real blow. They told me that because of the financial strain they'd been under, they wouldn't be able to pay for my college anymore. Just like that. They said they had to tighten the budget and couldn't swing it. I was stunned. I mean, hadn't they just said things were getting better? If business was on the mend, why couldn't they still help me out like they'd promised? And that's when they dropped another bomb. They had used the money they'd set aside for my college tuition to buy a vacation home in Cabo. Yep. A few months before things started going south, they had dipped into my college fund and bought a holiday house. I asked if they could sell it, but they admitted they didn't want to. They felt attached to it and were convinced the business would bounce back quickly enough that it wouldn't be a problem. They didn't expect the slump to last as long as it did, and instead of doing the responsible thing and selling off that property or even cutting back in other ways, they just kept spending, thinking it would all work out. And because of that, I got the short end of the stick. I sat there, completely blindsided, realizing that all the promises they'd made to me about college were basically worthless now. I wasn't angry that the business had struggled, stuff like that happens. But what tore me up was how they handled it. They never warned me, never gave me a heads up so I could try and earn some money or apply for extra aid or something. They just pulled the rug out from under me and expected me to deal with it. I knew I couldn't have made enough in a few months to cover all my tuition, but at least I could have done something, right? Found a part-time job, chipped in a little, maybe figured out a different plan. But they took that chance away from me. What made it worse was knowing they still had that vacation house and all their nice things, and they chose to hang on to all that instead of prioritizing my education. I was furious. I yelled, I cried, I let them have it. And all they kept saying was how much sentimental value those things held. Like that somehow made it okay. But how does that compare to my future? To something they promised me over and over again? It just felt like the ultimate betrayal. My parents had promised me so many times over the years that they'd handle everything when it came to college. So when they backed out, I was beyond disappointed, and I didn't even try to hide how hurt I was. What really stung wasn't just the broken promise, it was the way they'd kept everything from me. I mean, this was stuff I had every right to know, not just because it affected me, but because it would cause problems for me down the line. And it sure did. That day turned into one of the worst fights I've ever had with them. Things got ugly fast. They accused me of being money-hungry, ungrateful, and acting like some spoiled brat. But honestly, I don't think that was fair at all. I wasn't asking for anything new, I was just asking them to follow through on something they'd promised for years. I didn't expect them to pay for college just because they were my parents, I expected it because they said they would, time and time again. And if they'd been honest with me even a couple of months earlier, I think I could have handled it better. I could have made a plan, got a job, looked into alternatives. But instead, they dropped it on me just a few weeks before I was supposed to start. I had no backup, no direction, and I was falling apart. We said a lot of things in that fight, words that cut deep. Afterward, I stormed off to my room, slammed the door, and cried until the sun went down. It was my birthday, but I didn't want to talk to a soul. I shut off my phone and tried not to think about how hopeless my future looked. Sure, student loans were an option. But even those required my parents to sign off on them, and considering how shaky their finances were, I didn't think they'd want to take on even more debt. If they had been open to it, they probably would have mentioned it, but they didn't. So I was stuck, not knowing what to do, and just lying there in bed, crying because I felt so helpless. What hurt even more than the whole situation was that they never came to check on me. Not once. It was like they didn't care that their son was falling apart upstairs on his birthday. That silence from them, it cut deeper than any of the words we'd said during the fight. As the evening wore on, the sadness started to turn into something else, anger. I felt so betrayed and frustrated, and in the heat of the moment, I made a snap decision. I was going to leave. I told myself I'd show them what it felt like to be abandoned. So I started throwing some clothes and essentials into a bag, ready to run away. At the time, I had no idea the choice would end up changing the course of my life. I wasn't thinking clearly, I just wanted to get back at them, make them panic a little, maybe teach them a lesson. I snuck out quietly, slipping through the kitchen door without making a sound. Nobody heard me leave. Nobody stopped me. And just like that, I was gone. The only place I could think to go was to my girlfriend Haley's house. She's my wife now, Haley, 28, and we'd been together since we were kids. I knew I could count on her. She'd been calling me all morning, but I hadn't answered, so I figured it was time to show up in person. Haley's parents had always liked me, and their home had kind of become a second home for me over the years. I knew they'd take me in without hesitation. When I got there, Haley was the one who answered the door. She looked so relieved and said she'd been worried sick because I'd gone totally silent and even canceled the birthday party we'd invited them to. We hugged, and I broke down and told her everything, how my parents had dropped the bomb about college, how I'd fought with them, and how I'd packed a bag and left. She was just as stunned as I was. She knew my parents well, and she couldn't wrap her head around what they'd done. I told her I just needed a place to crash for a few days, and she was completely okay with it. But when I explained things to her parents, they weren't so on board with my plan. They were gentle about it, but they made it clear they thought I was being reckless. They said it wasn't a smart move, that it could come back to bite all of us, and they were right, but at the time, I wasn't in the mood to hear it. I was young and upset, and I tried to argue, but they stood firm. They told me they were going to call my parents and talk things through. I didn't really mind that. Honestly, I thought it might help. Our families were close friends, so I figured Haley's parents would be able to smooth things over. All I really wanted was an apology from my parents, a sign that they understood how badly they'd hurt me. But what actually happened was not what I expected. After about an hour on the phone, Haley's parents came back into the room and told me I could stay with them for a few days. They didn't go into much detail, and I didn't ask too many questions at first. I figured my parents just needed time to cool off and that they'd come around eventually. It didn't seem like a big deal. Plus, I didn't exactly mind getting to spend more time with Haley. What I didn't know was that the phone call hadn't gone well at all. Haley's folks later told me that when they'd called to let my parents know where I was and what had happened, they were expecting my parents to be concerned, or at the very least, embarrassed. I mean, yeah, I'd acted a little childish, but it was my birthday, and I was feeling hurt and blindsided. But my dad? He lost it. Apparently, he yelled at Haley's dad, said if I wanted to run away from home, then fine, I could stay gone. He told them he was done with me. Said he wasn't going to take responsibility for me anymore, that I was nothing but an ungrateful brat who only cared about money and didn't give a damn about my own parents. According to him, the only way I'd be welcome back home was if I apologized and begged for forgiveness. Otherwise, I was on my own. At the time, Haley's parents didn't tell me any of that. I guess they figured I was already dealing with enough and didn't want to pile it on. They just told me my parents weren't ready to talk yet, and that I could stay with them for a few days while things settled down. I appreciated that. It felt like someone was finally on my side. But 3 days later, they sat me down again, this time to deliver the full truth. They told me that my parents had no intention of reaching out. That they said they wouldn't speak to me until I apologized. And honestly, I was shocked. I couldn't believe they actually thought I was the one who needed to make things right. And yeah, I'll admit I was angry. I told Haley's parents flat out that I wasn't going to apologize to my folks. I truly believed I'd done nothing wrong. In my mind, I'd acted in a way anyone would have if they were in my shoes. I was hurt, I was blindsided, and I stood up for myself. Haley's mom and dad tried to talk me down gently. They made it clear they were on my side and agreed my parents had been unfair and downright thoughtless. But they also said that, at some point, I'd need to go back home, and to do that, I'd probably have to apologize. I shook my head and told them that wasn't happening. If going home meant swallowing my pride and saying sorry for something I wasn't sorry for, then I'd rather not go home at all. I even told them I didn't want to be a burden and that I'd start looking for someplace else to stay. But Haley's parents wouldn't hear it. They both told me I wasn't going anywhere, not until the whole mess got sorted out. They said their home was open to me, no questions asked. I kept insisting that I didn't want to cause any trouble, but they just brushed it off. They said I wasn't a burden, that they were happy to help. And honestly, that kindness meant the world to me. So, I stayed. Days turned into weeks, and I was still living under their roof by the time college was supposed to start. Now, here's where things took a turn I'll never forget. About a week after I'd left home, Haley's dad sat me down for a talk. He told me he'd taken care of my college tuition. Just like that. He'd found a way to get the money together, and he didn't want me to worry about paying it back right away or even worry about interest, because it wasn't a formal loan. He said I could pay him back when I got on my feet after graduation. Then he said I should call my dad, try to patch things up, and move back home now that the college issue was settled. But to me, it was never just about the money. That was never the core of the problem. What really broke my heart was how my parents had lied to me, giving me false hope for months, knowing they weren't going to follow through. They could have been honest. They could have told me sooner. But instead, they strung me along, pretending everything was fine, and then dropped it on me like a bomb at the last minute. Even if they'd gone completely broke, I still would have loved them, they were my parents, after all. But lying to me like that? I just couldn't forgive that. So, I told Haley's dad how much I appreciated what he was trying to do, but I couldn't make peace with my parents just yet. And I didn't want to take his money either, not if it meant owing him anything or putting him in a tough spot. I tried to turn it down. But he was having none of that. He told me he'd already borrowed the money from a friend, and it was a done deal. Whether or not I made up with my parents, I was going to college. He insisted that my future didn't need to be another casualty of this family feud. And once again, Haley's dad stepped in and gave me a second chance when I needed it most. Even though I still felt uneasy about taking the money, he made it sound simple: go to college, work hard, pay him back later, no pressure. And so, that's exactly what I did. Looking back, going to college was one of the best decisions I've ever made. It opened up my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. And it wouldn't have been possible without Haley's dad. He gave me a place to stay, funded my education, and never once made me feel like a burden. I couldn't have asked for more. He also tried several times to reach out to my parents and get them to come around, to help them see how much this had hurt me. But nothing worked. They refused to speak with me or even acknowledge the situation. Time just started slipping by. Before I knew it, years had passed and I still hadn't seen or heard from my parents since the day I left home. That awful fight on my 18th birthday? That was the last time I ever saw them in person. They didn't show up for my graduation. They didn't call, didn't write, didn't ask how I was doing. They completely cut me off, and I kept waiting, thinking maybe, just maybe, they'd reach out when things cooled down. But they never did. The more time went by, the clearer it became that they had no intention of fixing things. Meanwhile, Haley's family became my family. They were always there for me, through thick and thin. And even though there were days when I couldn't stop thinking about my real parents, wondering if they missed me or regretted anything, Haley's folks helped fill that hole in my heart. Sometimes, when I was down, they'd tell me, "Your parents would be proud of you." I wanted to believe that. But the truth was I didn't know. My parents had made their choice. And they chose silence. What made it even harder was knowing how close we used to be. Growing up, I had a great relationship with them. We laughed together, traveled, shared good times. So it was heartbreaking that one fight, just one, was all it took to destroy that bond. And even more painful was realizing they chose their pride and their possessions over their own son. They never called. And I never reached out again either. That's just how it ended. And now, well, it's been 10 years. A lot has changed since then. I got married a couple of years back, to the love of my life, of course. No surprises there, it was Haley. We tied the knot without my parents there, and I've made my peace with that. Our life together has been wonderful. And just about a year ago, we welcomed our baby boy into the world. He's perfect, completing our little family. My parents don't even know they have a grandson. And honestly, that's on them. By the time I got married, I had already stopped hoping they'd ever reach out. It became clear a long time ago that if they wanted to be in my life, they had plenty of chances. And they chose not to. Career-wise, things have come a long way too. I started at the bottom, just a regular job at a small firm. But I worked hard, showed up every day, and slowly worked my way up the ladder. Today, I'm in a management position and earning a good salary. More than I ever imagined at 18. And you know what? I paid off every penny I owed to Haley's dad. He never once brought it up or asked for anything in return, because that's the kind of man he is. But I wanted to show him how much I appreciated everything he did for me. So, when I paid him back, I added a little extra. Not that money could ever truly measure the gratitude I felt. In 10 years, my life has changed completely. I've built something solid, something I'm proud of. And I think that 18-year-old version of me, crying alone in his room, would be proud too. I never thought I'd make it this far. I never thought I'd be able to build a new life from the ground up after everything that happened. And by this point, I completely let go of the idea that I'd ever hear from my parents again. Because truthfully, they had more than enough opportunities to reach out, and they didn't. When I graduated, when I got engaged, got married, even when we had our first child, my parents never reached out. Not once. That was their choice. There's no way they didn't know about any of those big moments, either. I'd posted everything on social media, and plenty of family members who were connected with them must have seen it. Somebody had to have said something. But they didn't call. They didn't send a message. Nothing. And even after everything, I still missed them. I really did. But I stopped holding on to the hope that they'd ever reach out again. It became clear to me that, for them, nothing mattered more than their pride. They refused to admit they were wrong, not about the college fund, not about lying to me, not about cutting me off. And if they couldn't even acknowledge that, I couldn't let them back into my life. It would have just turned toxic again. If we were ever going to have a relationship, they needed to take some responsibility. That was the only way I could move forward. Then out of nowhere, about a week ago, my dad called me. It had been almost 10 years since we last spoke. At first, the conversation was light. He asked how I was doing, about work, about life in general. But after the small talk, he dropped the real reason for the call. My mom's health was failing. He said he wanted me to come home for a couple of days and spend some time with her. I asked him what was going on, and that's when he told me she'd been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. A couple of years ago. I was stunned. They'd known for years, and no one thought to tell me? No matter what kind of fight we'd had, this was serious. I couldn't believe they'd kept it from me. I lost it a bit. I snapped at him and asked why they'd kept something that important a secret. And he just said, "Well, I didn't think it mattered. I figured you wouldn't care since you hadn't reached out to us either." And just like that, we were back at it, arguing, blaming each other for who walked away first. He said I was stubborn and cold. I said he was selfish and proud. We just went in circles. Eventually, my dad got fed up. He said, "I knew this was a mistake. Your mom thought maybe you changed, but I knew you hadn't. You still don't care. You're still holding a grudge." And then, he hung up. That was it. Afterwards, I told Haley what happened, and she gave it to me straight. She said instead of fighting with my dad, I should have just agreed to visit my mom. Sick or not, they're still my parents, and if my mom was asking to see me, I should have gone. She said letting pride get in the way of seeing her again, maybe for the last time, would be a decision I'd regret. She wasn't wrong. She said maybe it was time to let go of the past, just for now, and go see them. Not to forgive everything. Not to pretend it didn't happen. But just, to be human. At first, I didn't agree. I thought my dad had been unfair, and I didn't want to walk into their house just to be cornered into an apology I didn't know. But deep down, I also knew I didn't want to live the rest of my life without ever speaking to them again. So I sat with that for a while. Update 1. After thinking things through, and after another talk with Haley, I realized she was right. I was acting just like my dad. Stubborn. Closed off. Refusing to make the first move. So I made a decision. I told Haley I was going to go see them. I wasn't going to apologize, because I still didn't feel like I owed one. And I wasn't expecting an apology from them either. But I was going to try. A couple hours later, I packed a bag and got ready to head out. Haley stayed home with our son. We talked about what might happen, and we agreed if things went well, I'd invite my parents over to meet their grandson. This feud had dragged on long enough. It was time to bury the hatchet. I wanted my son to know his grandparents. And I wanted to give myself a chance to know my parents again before it was too late. Update 2. I just got back from visiting them a few hours ago, and honestly, it went better than I ever could have imagined. My dad opened the door, and the moment he saw me, he broke down. He just pulled me into this huge hug and cried like a child. And that was it, I lost it too. It had been so long. Too long. Then I saw my mom. And it hit me hard. She looked so different, fragile. A shell of who she used to be. It was heartbreaking. But she smiled when she saw me, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. We spent the whole day catching up. I told them all about my life, Haley, our son. We talked about everything, including the fight from 10 years ago. And finally, we let it go. They apologized for the way they handled things back then. My dad said they should have been better parents. I told them maybe I could have been a better son too. Before I left, I invited them over for dinner next week. They're going to meet their grandson for the very first time, and I honestly don't know who's more excited about it, them, me, or Haley. I went home and told Haley everything. She was thrilled. We've decided next week's dinner is going to be special. Maybe the start of something new. Update 3. So, dinner just wrapped up a couple hours ago, and man, it was incredible. Everyone was there. My parents. Haley's parents. My son. The whole gang, finally under one roof. And for the first time in a very, very long time, it felt like family again. There was laughter. Some tears too, of course. My parents and in-laws hadn't seen each other in years, not since everything went down, and seeing them reconnect was something else. And when my parents met their grandson? That was emotional. We all cried a little, honestly. It made me realize just how much I'd missed them over the years. I didn't even notice how big that hole in my heart had gotten until it started to fill back up again. Now that we're finally back on good terms, I don't ever want to let that go. Especially with my mom's condition. I don't know how much time we've got left, but I do know I want to make the most of it. We've all agreed to keep this going, to meet more often, to rebuild what we lost. And I really hope we stick to that. Because no matter what happened in the past, we're family. And I'm not letting that slip away again.